It is the Banner Ravens podcast. Paul Mancano and Jonas Shaffer live on a Tuesday night to break down the breaking news that wide receiver DeAndre Hopkins is reportedly signing with the Baltimore Ravens on a one-year deal. We are going to break down what DeAndre Hopkins brings to this wide receivers core. We are going to go through what kind of player he is at this stage in his career and why this may have made sense for the Ravens to go bring in a 5-time Pro Bowl, potential future Hall of Fame wideout in DeAndre Hopkins. Jonas, start with our Who's Got It Better Than award. And of course, it goes to DeAndre Hopkins for agreeing to, I should say. They can't technically sign until tomorrow when the new league year begins, but a reported 1-year, $5 million deal that can be $6 million if he hits certain incentives. Adam Schefter of ESPN was the first to report it. And Jonas, this is a position that we thought the Ravens would address, thought the Ravens could address it in free agency. They needed a number 3 wide receiver. They have Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman at the top of their wide receiver depth chart. But beyond those two, Nelson Aguilar is a free agent. Tylan Wallace is a free agent. Devontae Walker last year in his rookie year caught just one pass. They needed another guy to add to that wide receivers room. And they got somebody that they've been linked to several times over the past half decade.
Yeah, and they got him for 50% of the cost of one Tutu Atwell. So I guess that tells you maybe where his market was or what he was willing to give up to go chase a ring. Obviously, we saw him get out of town in Tennessee last year and go join the Chiefs and come within one win of putting a ring on it. Didn't happen. So now he comes to Baltimore and he's stepping into a pretty nice offense. I don't think he's going to be wide receiver 1. I don't think he's going to be wide receiver 2. Maybe he's like wide receiver 2.5 with Bateman. But I think he probably he definitely gives you a more stable locker room presence than Deontay Johnson and what the Ravens thought they could kind of corral with him last year. I don't know if his highs are going to be as high as someone like a fully locked in Deontay Johnson's might have been last year, but I think he's going to be a great locker room presence. I think he could be, an X receiver, even though I think, as we'll talk about, like the Ravens aren't really wedded to that concept of just having one guy be the isolated receiver on one side of the field, especially because, he's not going to be, we think, an every down receiver. And, he's a guy that makes Lamar happy. And what is the most important part? What is the most important consideration in this, Ravens offseason, or pretty much every Ravens offseason, is like, what can we do to not piss off Lamar? Especially because Eric DeCosta himself, just a couple of weeks ago called him a stakeholder in this organization, basically. And the Ravens, if Eric DeCosta hasn't already headed down to South Florida at some point this offseason between now and the Combine a couple of weeks ago, then I'm sure he will, because I think priority 1 has to be following in the footsteps of what the Bills did with Josh Allen, getting a new contract. And if this is something that, put a smile on Lamar's face and showed him that this franchise is committed to winning with him while also rewarding him in ways both monetary and personnel wise, I think it's something you have to, give the Ravens a thumbs up for.
Yeah, I think a lot of fans might be hearing that an extension is coming from Lamar Jackson and think to themselves, didn't we just do this? Didn't Lamar Jackson just get an extension a couple years ago? But we're reaching the point now where Lamar Jackson doesn't have that many more years under team control, 2025, 2026, and 2027 through his age 30 season. So the earlier they're able to get something done with him, the better. And so you constantly have to pitch your franchise to your franchise quarterback. And these two are buds. DeAndre Hopkins, Lamar Jackson, they've expressed publicly their admiration for each other. And that's part of the reason that DeAndre Hopkins has been linked to the Ravens each time he has changed teams over the last 5 years. Let's talk about all the teams that he's been on, all the stops that he's made in his NFL career. 7 seasons with Houston. That's where he started, with the Houston Texans as a first-round pick in 2013. Was a 4-time Pro Bowler with the Texans. Then eventually had a whopping, by the way, 1,500 receiving yards in his 2018 season. He was one of the best wide receivers in all of football during his stretch in Houston. Is traded to the Arizona Cardinals in 2020. makes the Pro Bowl with the Cardinals in his first season. Then things start to get bumpy. Suspended for violating the league's PED policy shortly thereafter, misses some time with the suspension. He's released in 2023, signs with the Tennessee Titans on a 2-year deal. His first season with the Titans hits 1,000 yards. We saw just kind of the impact he can make in a game against the Ravens, as we might remember 2 years ago. Then he's traded to Kansas City midway through this past season. And not an outstanding run with the Chiefs. Goes to the Super Bowl, but doesn't put up great stats on the way, especially in the playoffs. Caught just 3 passes for 29 yards in that postseason run. And in the Super Bowl, caught 2 passes for 18 yards and had a mighty big drop at the end of the first half where he could have had a catch and run, potentially gotten to the end zone. And then after the game, also took a shot at the referees as well and wondered whether the media would cover what he thought was some biased officiating in that game. So things did not end great for him in Kansas City. And at this point in his career, he has racked up nearly 13,000 receiving yards. He's put together an unbelievable career. He's going to be 33 this season, Jonas. And I think the question, I'm not going to ask the question because of what he's got left in the tank, because again, I don't want to end up like Jerry Coleman. But he obviously, the peaks of his career are most likely behind DeAndre Hopkins. However, given what we saw from him the last couple years in Tennessee and in flashes with the Chiefs, he still can be a very productive player at times.
Yeah, and I don't think the Ravens will be seen. They don't typically see a lot of man coverage because man coverage is usually paired with a blitz, and Lamar showed this year, one, that he can still boogie out of any trouble, and also he can beat blitz. Blitz is finally better than pretty much any quarterback in the NFL. I think at this point, with how intuitive a receiver he is, you want him to be the kind of guy to settle into those soft spots in the zone, just use that connection that he's going to have to develop with Lamar to get open that way. It was interesting to look at the ESPN receiver tracking metrics, which I think typically correspond pretty well with, your idea of how good a receiver is at getting open. Surprising to me to see him 20th, I think, among wide receivers last year in his open score, which is basically measures, how far he is away from the nearest guy in coverage when the ball arrives at the catch point, I think, or when the ball is thrown. And you put that together with what the Ravens have potentially coming back. I think when I checked just before we hopped on the pod, I think it's 4 of the top 22 receivers, and that includes tight ends, because you have Mark Andrews, who was the best tight end in the NFL at getting open, according to ESPN. Rashad Bateman, Zay Flowers, I think both top 11, top 12, and DeAndre Hopkins, again, not far behind them. So that is a very promising foundation, I think, for this Ravens passing offense that was already pretty patently absurd last year. Obviously, I think we all expect DeAndre Hopkins to be a better option, a more sustainable option than Nelson Aguilar, who just kind of dropped off the face of the earth over the second half of last season. And I think he's probably going to, he's going to encourage Lamar by virtue of his presence and his highlight reel to maybe make some throws that he typically hasn't over his career.
Yeah, in terms of making riskier throws, throwing the ball down the sideline in tight coverage. I mean, that's an area of Lamar Jackson's game that he's tried with Rashad Bateman over the course of Rashad Bateman's time in Baltimore, and it just has not worked out all that much. And that's okay, because I think we've kind of realized Rashad Bateman doesn't really fit the prototype of an X wide receiver. He is an excellent route runner. He's great at getting open, but it's those tight window throws that Lamar has been kind of reticent to throw and don't really fit Zay Flowers' style, especially because he's a much smaller wide receiver and he's shifty. And also probably are not an ideal fit for Rashad Bateman. So you're talking about, adding a different kind of presence to this offense. And the X receiver is a spot that Eric DeCosta himself has said before. The organization, while they have had Lamar Jackson as quarterback, have not really hit on, whether trying to find those guys in the draft or trying to acquire those guys. He did an interview with Todd McShay a few weeks ago. I think it was at this point a couple of months ago when he was talking about what his tenure in Baltimore has looked like and areas that he thinks he could improve upon. And he specifically mentioned the X wide receiver. He said, quote, "We don't have that. The one piece we probably missed on is that big X presence. We never really had that. We tried to find that guy. That guy doesn't grow on trees," end quote. So he is acknowledged before, and that kind of turned some heads when he said that, because he's acknowledging that that's something that not only they haven't really done, but also that they probably need. And I think, yes, DeAndre Hopkins 4 or 5 years ago would fit that mold better than the 2025 version of DeAndre Hopkins, but he's still a big-bodied receiver. He's still very strong. And if he can get Lamar Jackson to trust him enough to throw into those tight windows and throw down the sideline more when it looks like it's going to be a 50-50 ball, that could improve this offense.
Yeah, Lamar had one of the fewest amount of tight window throws in the NFL last year among guys who, were, I think, over 300 attempts basically. So all the every game or close to every game starters. DeAndre Hopkins has been a target for some of these contested catch scenarios. I think he had a bunch of them last year. I think Gordon McGinnis of PFF, friend of the pod, said that he had more contested catches last year than anyone on the Ravens. That's not really the type of throw you want to be making. If you have your druthers, you want to be throwing to the open guy. You want to be throwing to the guy running away from coverage. But quarterbacks, time and again, no matter where he goes, have trusted DeAndre Hopkins to be a guy who can come down with these tight window targets. Has 73 tight window targets since 2022, according to True Media, 17th most in the NFL. Hasn't done especially well with them. And again, this is, you don't, without having looked at the film, you don't know whether to attribute that to Hopkins. You don't know whether to attribute that to scheme. You don't know whether to attribute that to the quarterback, but only 16 catches of those 73. So it's about a 22% catch rate. The average during that time period among, the more regular wide receivers was about 33%. But again, I think what I was looking forward to talking with you, Paul, about as we talked about wide receiver draft prospects, was there would be some day two, round two, round three guys who are these bigger bodied receivers who don't really have 4.4 speed, but can be options out wide and can develop into these potential X receivers that Lamar has never had. I mean, I think the fact that just lives rent free in my brain is just how few times Lamar has thrown a back shoulder pass in his career. So I went back and looked at this before we hopped on. DeAndre Hopkins in his last Pro Bowl season, which again, half a decade ago at this point, 2020 with the Cardinals, I think he went for 1,400 yards. He was targeted on 8 back shoulder fades. He caught 4 of them, I think, for over 100 yards or something. Lamar, over his career, has attempted 3 back shoulder targets, only one of which was a catch. And that was a slot fade. That was that's not the kind of down the sideline, technically speaking, thing that you think of Joe Burrow throwing to T. Higgins or Jamar Chase. That was the slot fade to Nelson Aguilar in 2023 in that game where the Ravens just couldn't catch anything. But that was a nice back shoulder throw. I don't know if Lamar intended it to be a back shoulder, just given his history, but that's not really been a throw that he's felt comfortable making. And, DeAndre Hopkins doesn't have this huge battleship frame. He's only 6'1", but the 218 pounds, as you can see on a guy like A.J. Brown, is enough to kind of create the kind of wiggle room that you need to go up and make that catch, even when it looks like you're closely guarded by the cornerback or the safety.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the draft prospects, Jonas. We're already in tape grinding season right now, and you know how much I love to watch college highlight tapes on YouTube and text you guys that I think the Ravens should take. And I reached out to you a couple of weeks ago because there was, I think it's Trey Harris, the Ole Miss wide receiver, who's 6'2", 204, who's going to be probably a day 2, day 3 pick. And maybe it's the Ole Miss jersey because they always churn out great wide receivers, but I was seeing the type of body, the type of receiver he is, and I could just see him being a perfect fit in Baltimore because he is that guy. He has an inch on DeAndre Hopkins. He's slightly smaller at that size, but you could see him being a big-bodied, go up and get it wide receiver. And I think that's something that the Ravens desperately needed to add. And this, to me, was probably the best route to do it. They tried to add that guy in Devontae Walker in the 4th round last year. they knew the risks when they took him. He was available in the 4th round for a reason. So it's not like they totally whiffed on him, but it was pretty clear in his first NFL season that he still needs a lot of work. Only 1 catch last year that was in that Giants blowout, and it was for a touchdown. A nice moment for him, but not the most polished route runner. He is fast and he is strong, but at this point, he is not a complete product. And maybe he could develop into something. But to me, free agency or trade made the most sense in terms of addressing this position, because if you take another wide receiver, odds are they were not going to invest their 1st round pick in a wide receiver. And they probably weren't going to invest a 2nd round pick as well. So you're talking about taking another potential project at wide receiver, and that guy might not help you in 2025. So to me, signing a veteran to a 1-year deal for a reported $5 million, maybe $6 million deal was probably the best way to go about addressing this spot.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of fans fall in love with PFF grades, especially when they say 90 plus, and Devontae Walker's 90 plus grade from that Giants game got a lot of Ravens fans pretty hot and bothered when that was the one route I think that he ran all game. Maybe he had like 1 or 2 others, but it's pretty easy to get a 90 plus grade when you score like a 30 plus yard touchdown and do a nice toe tap. So he could still develop into a nice piece in this offense. I think the Ravens, with Todd Monken and his experience as a former wide receivers coach, does a great job of, putting himself in the shoes of wide receivers and understanding how they work, how they operate, how they think. And, obviously Devonta has been through a lot from college to the NFL, just with his whole journey of getting to the league that, I think that first year in the league is always tough. Not a lot of guys who were taken after day 2 last year did a whole lot. Obviously you would like him to step into that wide receiver 4 role. I guess you could say that this signing maybe slightly decreases the likelihood that the Ravens sign Tylan Wallace, even though I think you could argue that he's probably more valuable to the Ravens as a special teamer at this point, considering what they lost yesterday with Chris Board and Malik Harrison heading out of Baltimore. And, we don't know what's going to happen with Ardarius Washington. We don't know how Trenton Simpson and Nate Wiggins' role on special teams might change if they become, every down pieces for this Ravens defense. So the trickle down effects are really interesting. I think it's a good thing if he does settle into this X receiver position. That means that you can do a lot of fun stuff before the snap with Zay Flowers, because if Zay Flowers is able to play off the line of scrimmage, then you can send him in motion as much as you want. And I think you could also send, Rashad Bateman if he doesn't have to be that X. You want to keep defenses on their toes. I think even though Zay is obviously the more jitterbuggy of the two, I think Rashad has shown time and time again that when he puts the ball in space, when he gets the ball in space, he's able to make guys miss. He has good acceleration. Obviously the quick games, what got hurt Zay last year. So maybe they would be a little bit finicky about that going into next year. But I think the trickle down effects on those guys is going to be productive. And I guess we have to talk about the other elephant in the room with what this might mean for the biggest elephant in the room with Mark Andrews and how it might affect the tight end room.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because when the Ravens last year traded for Deontay Johnson at the deadline, what you said, and I think this is in line with the Ravens' thinking, was that made the Ravens' offense more versatile, so that if they get into a matchup where the defense is not allowing them to go into 12 personnel too much and trying to keep them down to 1 tight end, well, hey, they had 3 good, productive wide receivers that they can throw out there that can make them more versatile. That didn't work out. Deontay Johnson did not work out. But adding DeAndre Hopkins, I think the Ravens are now thinking that they can be a very productive offense with 3 wide receivers out there. Of course, you can't have 3 wide receivers, 2 tight ends, too often. So the question is, Mark Andrews, he's got a deadline coming up on the 16th when the Ravens would owe him more money. They could designate him with a post-June 1 release. We've talked about why that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because he's still a very productive player. They could also designate him with a post-June 1 trade. There could be a lot of teams that would be interested in his services, considering he's on the final year of his deal and still productive and still not yet 30 years old. I don't know if this DeAndre Hopkins signing necessarily changes the Ravens' likelihood that they will trade Mark Andrews, but maybe it makes it a little bit easier to do so because you're adding another veteran weapon, and maybe the offense is primed to change just so slightly, add more wide receiver power, and perhaps shift slightly away from 12 personnel, go with just Isaiah Likely as taking the bulk of the snaps at tight end and Charlie Kolar coming in occasionally.
Yeah, I mean, I guess before we talk about what Mark's role in this offense could be, we got to talk about what DeAndre Hopkins' role in last year's Chiefs offense was, because that was not a great receiving core after they were ransacked by injuries. And when D Hop landed there, he did not become this guy who was on the field for every snap. Just looking at his snap shares from last year, I think I see one game after he landed there where he played more than 60% of the snaps. And again, that was an offense that really needed some juice in the pass game. So the whole complication with all this is like there are only so many snaps to give to allocate to these guys. You can get heavy with Charlie Kolar and Pat Ricard. You can go more dynamic through the air with Isaiah Likely and Mark Andrews. Obviously, we all are all expecting Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman to probably be over 75% of the snaps, just because they are younger, they are faster, they are more dynamic. But with this now opening the world of the possibility of 11 personnel at a more regular rate than when we saw last year. And again, this is something that we talked about a bunch, early last season, that Todd Monken, the belief is that he would prefer to play 11 personnel rather than the more heavy stuff. Certainly didn't matter last year. The Ravens were devastated in pretty much every formation, but you would be paying Mark Andrews, $16 million? That's his cap hit for 2025, to play maybe like 50 to 60% of the snaps. That's kind of asking a lot. That's kind of building the lily. You're not really getting the most bang for your buck. And maybe it doesn't matter because guys get hurt, and we saw Zay get hurt, and we know Rashad Bateman's injury history, and DeAndre Hopkins is old for a receiver. So maybe you just hold on to that piece, knowing that Mark can serve in a lot of times as a de facto wide receiver with his skill out wide. But it just comes down to this whole issue of opportunity cost and what you are losing if you were to get rid of Mark Andrews, but also, what you would be losing if you keep him in Baltimore for this last year of his deal.
Yeah, and you talked about making Lamar Jackson happy, and there are a few guys that Lamar Jackson likes, trusts, respects more on this Ravens roster than Mark Andrews. And perhaps if the Ravens were to part ways via trade or release with Mark Andrews this offseason, I think it's safe to say that might irk Lamar Jackson, but it might ease the pain if they bring in somebody like DeAndre Hopkins that we know he likes, somebody that we know he can probably build chemistry with very quickly. So again, not necessarily saying one move predicates the other, but just reading the tea leaves here, given what we've heard Eric Costa say about Mark Andrews, especially at the combine, I think it's highly possible that Mark Andrews could be on the trade block and could get moved within the next few days.
What I was reminded of when I was writing up the Chris Board stuff was that, when the Ravens had that playoff game against the Steelers in January, they had those captain's patches on their jerseys. They typically, go through, they rotate through their captains by game. They don't have a set 3 or 4 guys who go out to the pregame coin toss every week. It's just, situational, basically, who's going out there. But it was noteworthy to me who the Ravens game captains were. Looking back now, it was Lamar, obviously, Derrick Henry, Roquan Smith, Marlon Humphrey, also there. Chris Board, as the special teams representative, was a captain, and obviously that speaks to what his potential loss could be. But then the 6th guy was Mark Andrews, and that you could say, oh, it's just a piece of cloth. Oh, maybe the Ravens and John Harbaugh didn't think a whole lot about who would be wearing the C on their chest, but I don't think it's insignificant either. That guy means a lot to a lot of people in that Ravens building, and it would take one heck of an offer for the Ravens, I think, to move off Mark Andrews. I don't know what that would be. Obviously, it's very locked down at the castle right now, especially with us at the Banner. But
why? Why do you say
that? I just don't know what Mark Andrews' asking price would be right now, considering where he is age-wise, and also I guess just the recent injury history as well.
Yeah. Well, a couple more thoughts before we move on to some of the other free agent moves that we've seen in the last 36 hours. A couple more thoughts on DeAndre Hopkins. I mean, my word of the day here, Jonas, is predictable. Definition expected, especially on the basis of previous or known behavior, first recorded 1815 to 1825. Jonas, this move was so predictable that I predicted it on our last podcast. Just want to give myself a pat on the back. But this falls in line so much with the moves of Ozzie Newsome and Eric DeCosta of signing these older veteran wide receivers and trying to squeeze the last bits of juice out of these guys. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think there are good and bad examples, and even ones in between in the last decade or so with the Ravens. I mean, Mike Wallace had a 1,000-yard season in his, age 31 or whatever season. Steve Smith Sr., obviously, at the very end of his career, had some nice moments with the Ravens. But then you think about the ways in which this has gone poorly, and you think about Deshaun Jackson and Des Bryant and maybe Jeremy Maclin, if you want to be cruel and put him in that category. But then there's also the in-between. I mean, OBJ had a 500-yard season, didn't palpably change the offense, but, was still productive and might honestly be the last productive season of his NFL career, given the injuries and troubles that he's fallen on since then. So there are different ways that this could go, but this is just very predictable. This is the thing that we like to see Eric DeCosta, the Ravens, like to do the most, is try to get this aging wide receiver and try to get him to be productive for just one more season before he calls it a career.
The biggest testament to DeAndre Hopkins' durability is that the last potentially over-the-hill receiver from Clemson that the Ravens brought in, hoping for some juice, was
Sammy Watkins. Yeah,
in 2021. There's not a chance in hell that you will get this. You want to guess at about what age? Because I don't know. I guess I can probably do the math in my head. Do you want to guess what age Sammy Watkins was when the Ravens brought him in? And we were already doubting just how much he would bring to the Ravens passing corps.
He was in college when I was in college. I remember I saw him torch Syracuse. So I think he was like a junior when I was like a freshman or something like that. So he was probably, go back 3 years. He was probably like 27, 28.
Yeah. He's 31 right now, which is crazy because it seems like he's been in the league for so much longer, just by the sheer virtue of him having been talked about as, well, he's been out of the league for 2 years now. And also before then, there was a very obvious like 2 or 3 year window where people were talking about how he's not going to be the same receiver he ever was. And here DeAndre Hopkins is. I mean, he's not that far removed from being a 1,000-yard receiver. Do I think he's going to get that close now that he's in Baltimore? Probably not, just because he's not going to be on the field that much. But, he's still reasonably productive. He's able to run the full route tree. We were just talking before we hopped on. He doesn't really major in any one thing, just to rattle off some of the stuff. Crossing route, 14%. This is from last year. Crossing route, 14%. Slants, 12%. In route, 7%. Out routes, 13%. Hitches, 16%. Corners, 9%. Posts, 6%. Goes, 16%. So he's able to run just about whatever you want. Is he good at all of those? I guess we'll have to dig into the film to really judge that. He's certainly not gonna have the kind of downfield separation speed that he did early in his career, but he's always been a guy that's one with nuance, with physicality, with being able to draw flags. He drew, I think, 3 the defensive pass interference either on the back shoulders in 2020. Something like that. He's able to get that physicality and make it work. So, listen, I think it's the kind of thing that the Ravens do a good job of at seizing on value and keeping their quarterback happy and healthy. And I guess we'll see. We'll know pretty early on just what kind of chemistry he has with Lamar, because that is obviously the big thing. Like, is Lamar going to trust him enough to throw those 50-50 balls when there's a chance that if he goes on to his next read, Zay Flowers is open, even if a little bit less dangerous.
How about the Chiefs-Ravens Venn diagram of wide receivers too? Hollywood Brown, Sammy Watkins is on that list. I mean, at some point, this means that the Ravens might end up with Xavier Worthy. Never know.
Do you think his character counts?
Yeah, we'll see.
I mean, just like not even just the receivers, but I mean, I hope that the game is early enough in the season that all these guys would be healthy, because as we talked about on Monday, you have the sliding doors situation with the Chiefs offensive line not having Ronnie Stanley, not having Roger Rosengarten, and now assuming that DeAndre Hopkins can make it healthy to that Ravens Chiefs game that we're getting in Arrowhead Stadium next season. That's another guy that I'm sure we're going to be talking and writing a lot about.
Yeah.
Kansas City long enough, I think, to really develop, to kind of lay down roots and become a beloved member of that Chiefs fan base. But he was productive enough. Did some good things. Was able to make some memories for Chiefs fans, and now he's in Baltimore going for the ring that eluded him last year.
Yeah. What do you give? You wanted to have a grade, give an A through F grade last time we were discussing the Ronnie Stanley extension. So what's your grade A through F for the signing of DeAndre Hopkins?
I mean, I think you probably have to give it at least a B plus, just considering how ludicrous this whole market is for everyone. Like, don't even if you're put off by the $5 million price tag, which I don't know how you would, when you consider it as a fraction of what the salary cap will be this year, it's awfully team friendly, I think, knowing what other wide receivers are going for. I mean, why don't you talk while I look up what other wide receivers have signed for this year? I guess we haven't seen some of the big guys, like the Diggs domino hasn't fallen, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And I think that like $5-6 million is probably a little bit less than I would have expected. I would have expected at least like $10 million for DeAndre Hopkins, a short-term deal. But I also would have expected, if he had to settle for a deal like this, that he probably would have waited a little bit. That it would have taken a few weeks or maybe a month or so before he finally realized that there weren't that many options out there. To get this done a day before the actual league year starts, I think has to be probably a B plus for me as well. It's the grade I gave the Ronnie Stanley signing. And you look at the guys that are out there in free agency, a lot of them, we said last podcast, fit in this category of guys who are past their prime, who are you're just trying to get 1 or 2 more years out of. And Stephon Diggs is probably the best of that, assuming he comes back healthy. Amari Cooper, though, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, I would probably take DeAndre Hopkins above those 3 guys, wouldn't you?
Yeah. And just looking at the list of wide receivers, De'Ami Brown, he had an incredible postseason run with the Commanders there. Excuse me. I think he went over 80 yards in all but the last game against the Eagles when he had 42 yards. But he still only finished that final season in Washington with 308 yards total, 1 touchdown. Obviously, he's much younger than Hop is. He still has that speed that made him a 3rd-round pick coming out of North Carolina in 2021. But he signed a deal worth $10 million with the Jaguars. The Jaguars under new ownership, but they're also the same team that gave Devin Duvernay a healthy deal and then cut him after seeing what we all saw in Baltimore him to be, which was a guy who did not have a lot of tread on those tires. It was not the same dynamic athlete that was, running kickbacks and able to do stuff behind the line of scrimmage. So Mac Hollins got 2 years, $8.4 million, so close to the AAV of this one. Hollywood Brown, I think, signed for about $10-11 million with the Chiefs. Yeah, 1 year up to $11 million, so probably closer to 7 or 8 with some incentives. So yeah, I mean, maybe the cliff is much closer than it appears around the league, and maybe we're talking about how the Ravens really need Devontae Walker to step up for DeAndre Hopkins, who can't beat a linebacker in coverage. But for right now, I think you have to like what the Ravens did with this deal.
Yep. All right. Let's talk about the other moves that we've seen around the league in the last 36 hours. Let's start with Pancake Pack because Patrick Ricard is coming back. It was pretty much expected the way that he spoke glowingly about his time with the Ravens and locker room cleanout day. We knew the organization's love for him and respect for him. Jonas, you've written about on the BaltimoreBanner.com, where you can subscribe $1 for 6 months, about how integral he was. Do you say integral or integral? I've heard it both ways.
Integral?
Integral. I've heard
integrity. Integral.
Yeah, I don't know. How important he was in the Ravens offense last year, blocking for Derrick Henry. And the Ravens bring him back, reported by Diana Rossini of The Athletic, 1-year deal, fully guaranteed. There was a brief moment where it was reported that Kyle Juszczyk was going to be released by the 49ers. And we thought, ooh, could there be a reunion there if Patrick Ricard goes elsewhere? Not meant to be. Pat Ricard comes back. And Jonas, this feels like a good match.
Yeah, and again, at a bargain price, I think it was close to $3 million, and with the collective bargaining agreement loopholes, they are basically dropping that down closer to 1.5 million. And again, this is a guy who, on his last deal, when he wasn't coming off all pro seasons, obviously he was, in his 20s at that point, but signed for, I think, like $3.5 to $3.7 million per year. So I think that the desire to end his career in Baltimore, or at least come back for another year in Baltimore, definitely helped the Ravens at the negotiating table. I imagine that they got considerably less than what he could have gotten on the open market if there was a market that did in fact materialize for a fullback like Pat Ricard. And when I talked to him last year for the story, in early to mid January, I think, like, he said that there was like this real and obvious learning curve to playing with Derrick Henry, because as soon as Derrick Henry gets the ball, he's giving you no time whatsoever to make your block. He just wants to hit that hole as soon as possible. So Derrick Henry was running into Pat Ricard in training camp, in the preseason, early in the season. But once those guys figured out how each other like to move, how they like to, set up their blocks, how they played with certain leverages, it really felt like a glove in hand fit. And I think it was not until the last year, or like one of the last games of the season, maybe the playoff game against the Steelers, where like Derrick Henry had a game in which he scored a touchdown in which Pat Ricard wasn't on the field. Those guys were just like peanut butter and jelly together. They're just physical anomalies who I think pose just real, logistical and kind of practice quandaries. Like, how do you prepare for someone as big as Pat Ricard and someone as big as Derrick Henry on the practice squad? A lot of teams just don't have those guys to do it. So, obviously we don't know how big or how often Pat Ricard will be on the field next year, because of all this uncertainty with what kind of offense the Ravens are going to run, with all the uncertainty over, Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely and now DeAndre Hopkins. But I think if you have an offense that can be one thing in one drive, or one thing in one game, or one thing in another month, and then mutate from drive to game to month, like pretty easily, toggle between it, like you're choosing languages and Duolingo, I think that makes you really, really tough as an offense. And I think that was probably the biggest credit to Todd Monken, that they were pretty close to like elite efficiency in just about whatever they decided to do last year. And Pat Ricard was a big part of that.
Rest in peace to the Duolingo owl. So they bring back Patrick Ricard. The Ravens did lose some guys in free agency, reportedly. Patrick McCary signing with the Jacksonville Jaguars on a 3-year, $37.5 million deal. That is just way out of the Ravens' price range. Josh Jones, another versatile offensive lineman, signs a 1-year deal worth up to $4.275 million with Seattle. And then the pair of linebackers, Chris Board signs or is going to sign a 2-year, $6 million deal with the Giants. Malik Harrison, 2-year, $10 million deal with the Pittsburgh Steelers. All of those deals are probably more than the Ravens were willing to pay. All guys I think you could make cases, though, to bring back in Baltimore, because they were all nice depth pieces. So when you're talking about losing offensive line depth in Josh Jones and Patrick McCary, and you're talking about losing linebacker depth in Chris Board and Malik Harrison, those are spots that the Ravens are going to need to go back to the bargain bin, I think, this offseason and try to find some under the radar guys. They've done it before. Did it with John Simpson is a great example, and they can do it again, but they are now without those guys that they knew could fit well into their system.
I forget, Paul, have we talked about like this idea of the Ravens because of Lamar heading into this stars and scrubs? And I don't know if there's another way that's as florid language-wise to describe the kind of roster building that the Ravens might be having to embrace. And obviously, there are a lot of guys on this Ravens roster who will be cheap, but will definitely not be scrubs. But have we talked about maybe this possibility of where the Ravens are heading and kind of embracing what the Rams were in their last Super Bowl iteration?
I don't think we have. It's 8:51 on a Tuesday night, so I don't know if I want to get too far down that lane. But you know what? I think I could see
it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to explain. Basically, like
no, I know what you're
Lamar's
saying.
contract, with Lamar's contract going up, with the big money deals that they already have guys locked in for, and that they're going to give to guys like Tyler Linderbaum and Kyle Hamilton and perhaps A. Flowers. There's not going to be a lot of room for, I think, these like mid-level contracts. For a guy like Patrick McCary, who was, signed for like $5 to $7 million a year in Baltimore because he could be your do everything fixer. Malik Harrison would have been nice, to your point, to have back in Baltimore because of his versatility on defense, because of his special teams impact. But again, $5 million a year for a guy who might not even be a starter on your team. I think we are heading to a point where like so much of the cap, and maybe it's always been like this, but it just feels like we're approaching a kind of new dawn, but so much of the cap is going to be tied up in a very, very elite upper crust of Ravens. And then the rest of the cap is just going to be spread out among the like 30 to 40 draft picks who are on their rookie deal, because that's all the Ravens are going to have space for, in their budget. No matter how much the cap goes up, you're always going to have these escalating cap hits for these guys, because that's typically how you build contracts that are moderately backloaded. So I just wonder if we are kind of, as long as Lamar is going to be one of the top 5 to 7 highest paid quarterbacks in the league, if we are like past the days where guys who are good but not potential impact players like a Derrick Henry, or even in this case like a DeAndre Hopkins, are even getting like the time of day from the Ravens front office.
Yeah, I mean, anything
for that second or third contract.
Right. And you saw a lot of deals be done. This is not a great free agent class. We've talked about it before. You saw a lot of deals. You saw some ridiculous deals, by the way. I don't know how, was it Will Fries? Is it pronounced Fries? The interior offensive lineman got like $88 million or something like that. Some ridiculous money being thrown around. But you also saw a lot of mid-level contracts, like 3 years, $20 million, 2 years, $15 million, something like that. And it's just, you see these go by and you think the Ravens aren't going to do that. They just don't have, of the space to do something like that unless they really believe in the guy. And for DeAndre Hopkins, this is a 5-6 $1 million deal. So this is not a huge investment. And that's the kind of move that's on the upper echelon of the kind of move that they'll make. The rest of the guys are going to be $1, $2, maybe $3 million contracts from here on out, pretty much, because of the number of guys that they are going to be having to pay big time money for. And it can be frustrating for a lot of fans, but also, look, the first day of free agency is when a lot of teams make huge mistakes, and the Ravens are not in a position right now where they can make huge mistakes, because that would require restructuring contracts. And in order to do that, you have to be really confident that the guy that you're bringing in is going to be worth doing all that stuff for. What do you think is? Go ahead.
Sorry, Paul. I was just gonna. I think it shows how much, when we're talking about the broader context of the Ravens team building philosophies, and getting the most out of these guys on their rookie contracts, and then if they don't fit into the Ravens budget, sending them on their merry way and hoping to collect a comp pick in the process. Obviously, Patrick McCary with his deal could be on that round 4 to round 5 price range for next year. Brandon Stevens, we haven't talked about, got a bag from the Jets, could also be a guy who fits into that round 4, round 5 compensatory pick range next year. Eric Costa and Lamar, we presumably thought so highly of DeAndre Hopkins that they said, we want you, even though the signing is going to cancel out like the Malik Harrison deal on the, in the NFL calculus of how this stuff gets done. Obviously, that's like a small price to pay for a guy who could be a really, really important piece in this offense, but we know how considered the Ravens are with all this stuff. We've seen them kind of work deals with agents where they tell guys to wait until after the compensatory pick cutoff deadline is so that we can get you on our books and not have to worry about losing a 5th or 6th or 7th round pick. So the fact that they went out and were aggressive like this in this way, I think is pretty telling about just how much they think DeAndre Hopkins can help them, at least at this price point in 2025.
Yeah, we didn't even mention the Brandon Stevens contract. What is it? 3 years, $36 million. I mean, I honestly could see a team like talking themselves into him because he's got great size. He's done it before. He had a great year in 2023, but how can you turn on the tape from last year and convince yourself that guy is worth that amount of money?
If there is a coach, though, if there's a head coach out there who I think I would trust to get the most out of Brandon Stevens, outside of like the 2023 Ravens coaching staff, it probably would be Aaron Glenn. And, you think about what he was able to do in Detroit last year with not a whole lot of high-end talent. They drafted Terry and Arnold last year and, kind of had the bumps and stuff with him. But he's a guy who loves defense, who was a great, defensive back himself. And Brandon Stevens is ultimately a guy who's like 6'1", 205, 210, has good speed, has a lot of potential. But he's also a guy who, as I was going back and looking at the ugly stats from last year, allowed more catches of 20+ air yards than any player in the NFL. And that is the conundrum that Brandon Stevens presents that the Jets are going to have to deal with as they try to find a home for him in that defense, which should be, pretty good next year.
I think he finished with the second most yards allowed in coverage last year as well of any defensive back. Yeah. Not great. All right, let's wrap this thing up. It's 9:00. The Ravens could be making moves before we go to bed, but we will have complete coverage on the BaltimoreBanner.com, where you can subscribe $1 for 6 months. Jonas already has an article up there about DeAndre Hopkins. Gianna Hahn has some good stuff coming soon. Kyle Goon, of course, has his thoughts there. So subscribe to the Banner, subscribe to the Banner Ravens podcast, and write us a 5-star review, and I'll read it out here on the show. At Jonas_Shaffer is his handle. I'm at Paul Mancano and at All Banner Sports. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.